So much. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the Belonging Project, Unpacking Racial Trauma and Strategies for Belonging and Equity at Work and Our Communities. For those of you who have joined the Belonging Project before, you know that it is a compilation of different entities hosted by Safe Art to bring together the conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the legal profession, all the way from pre-law students to folks who have been practitioners. And so we thank you for joining here today. This is an important conversation. My name is Paula Edgar, and I'm really happy to be here today to help to drive this conversation. I am the CEO of PGE Consulting Group. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, speaker, keynote speaker, mother, and all-around fun person. Our bios are on the website in terms of gathering information about who we are, but I am going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves one by one, starting with Jacqueline. Jacqueline Walker.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Walker. I'm the founder and CEO of The Well Firm. The Well Firm is a consulting agency that supports high-stress professions and focuses on improving culture and providing in-house access to wellness resources. Nice to meet you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jacqueline. Next up, Lindsay Dates.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lindsay Dates. I'm a litigator at Barnes & Thornburg. I'm also involved with the few committees around town, including the Chicago Committee on Minorities and Large Law Firms and the Black Male Lawyers Association. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Corey Carew.
Hi, my name is Corey Carew. I'm the Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer at Sci-Fi Shaw. I also lead the Belonging Project. But for purposes of this discussion, I'd like to introduce myself as an Enneagram 1, as someone who has Achievers number 2 on her Gallup Strength Finders, and as someone who lives and thrives with high functioning depression.
And Erica Stallings.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Stallings. I am an Associate General Counsel at Facebook, where I focus on counseling on the use of licensed music across the Facebook family of apps. I am also a freelance writer, and my work focuses on racial health disparities and the impact of the experience of Black women in corporate America.
So now that you know who is going to be participating in today's conversation, I want to talk about what led us to wanting to have this conversation and kind of where we've been over the past year. Racial trauma is probably an understatement in terms of what we experienced in the last year, starting with communities being disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are still in. And for every presentation that I do, I send my love, heart, and empathy out to anyone who is struggling, having to do with navigating the pandemic at this time, and particularly people of color who we know have been disproportionately affected by this pandemic. That was what, January, February, March of last year. We coasted along in quarantine, challenging for those of you who are like me and an extrovert, and had several different things that sort of shocked us. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. And then what I call the tipping point of last year, which was the killing of George Floyd. And my hypothesis as to why it affected us in a different way than it has with other killings that we have seen that were police involved, with Black men who were unarmed, was the difference was we were in quarantine. I think we had no place to run, no place to hide. We had to look at 8 minutes of 46 seconds of trauma. And while this country has a history of watching lynchings, we have not had to do that in the way that we had to do that in the past year. And because of the way in which violence against Black people has been sort of numbed in the way in which we navigate the world, we couldn't deal with the numbness anymore. And other people that started to say, oh, this is terrible. Right. And so a lot of my conversation during the last year was welcome to trauma, because we've been in it for a while. We kept on going. And then there was, Breonna Taylor's case, and said, in terms of when they said, we're not going to hold people accountable the way that they should be held accountable. And then the elections and all of the different conversation that happened around race, racial equity, lack thereof, the emergence of white supremacy in a much more profound way that had us really reeling. Exclamation pointed by the storming of the Capitol in January of this year. And then the continuity that had occurred. And there were other tipping points. For example, there are folks who got to celebrate Juneteenth and never knew it before. There were lots of things that happened in that year, but that's a lot in a very short amount of time. And all of us, regardless if you identify as an underrepresented minority group or not, we're suffering trauma because of that. And so here we are thinking, what do we need to do about this piece? And I want to start the conversation with having Jacqueline talk to us about what is the impact of what I just said. Right? Tell us the clinical piece of this, and so I'll go ahead and start crying while you talk.
Please don't cry. I'll be forced to switch on my therapist hat. So just to define racial trauma, I really like to use the term race-based traumatic stress, because I think when we're talking about things when it comes to race, when it comes to racism or racial, people who are in the majority or people with privilege tend to turn it off, right? People understand what traumatic stress is, but ultimately racial trauma is the cumulative effects of racism on someone's mental and physical health. And so, Paula, you hit the nail on the head. Over the past year, what people of color have seen is a culmination of years of systemic injustices, right? Years. And so we've experienced the institutional murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the race-based murder of Ahmaud Arbery. In 2019, FBI reported that the US reached its highest hate crime rate since 2008, and 48.7% of those crimes perpetuated anti-Blackness. And so then we've experienced widening socioeconomic gaps, further environmental injustices, and continued inequalities in access to medical resources that have disproportionately affected people of color. And so none of the things that I just mentioned, none of the things that you opened with are new to communities of color. The impact is so great. The COVID pandemic further just exacerbated all of these flaws within our systems. And people have been unable to distract themselves. They've been forced to pay attention. On the one hand, that attention is great because it's fostered more dialogue like this, right? Around truly changing our societal landscapes and fostering equity. But for people of color who have lived with the knowledge of these stressors, who have had to put aside experience in the workplace, or insults on daily commutes, or discrimination from peers and colleagues and seniors, those people of color who have subconsciously also carried the burden of knowing that people who look like them are dying from multifaceted negligence, right? That attention, that for being forced to pay attention is traumatic. It creates a chronically hostile environment for communities of color. And that impact is immense, right? And it shows up mentally and emotionally in the forms of anxiety, of depression, of suicidal ideation, and of anger. It shows up physically with body aches or tension headaches or high blood pressure. It shows up cognitively, whether you're feeling numb, not feeling anything at all, feeling fearful or disengaged. And it also shows up in our relationships, right? It shows up in our partnerships. It shows up with our families, it shows up with loved ones, with friends, and it shows up in our workspaces. And so I think this conversation is really important in terms of not only how that impacts us, but how to move forward, and so that we can create a less hostile work environment for communities of color.
Whew. That was a lot. Something that you just, when you were listing the bullet points of the physical effects of racial trauma, I took a deep breath because I thought to myself, I know so many people who have come out and identified themselves as suffering from depression, of having high blood pressure, hands raised. I got that in 2020, of gaining weight, of losing weight, of their inability to sort of navigate in the ways that they had been before. And that by itself is a lot. right? And then there's all the other things that continue to happen. And so what I would like to do is to put a literal face on this and having our panelists talk about how this has actually shown up for them within their workspaces. So Corey, I'm going to start with you. How does racial trauma show up in the legal workplace?
Yeah, it shows up in the legal workplace in some of the ways that you would anticipate. For example, alcoholism, depression, restlessness, burnout, feelings of exacerbating the isolation that often comes with not being included in the first place. So then that gets impacted. You know, when you are constantly on the receiving end of microaggressions, it also not only makes you hyper vigilant, but you end up putting so much energy into not being reactive to the constant dings. And that takes away the energy that you could be using to be creative and innovative. So it shows up in ways that are sometimes subtle. The difficult part is it can be commingled with other things. And so separating out which part of this is insanity of the legal practice and how we work versus the racial aspect can be difficult. But I do know that last year, a word that I heard a lot from a lot of diverse attorneys, particularly BIPOC attorneys, was exhaustion, was that sense of exhaustion.
So just so that we can all be aligned, because I know we're throwing out a lot of letters and a lot of words, and I want to just make sure that everybody has an understanding of what some of the terminology that's being utilized means, and to do a couple of pieces of housekeeping. Number one, BIPOC is the acronym for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. That's one. Two, POC is people of color. Black is Black. I just want to make sure we're all aligned at the same place. Microaggressions are described as smaller institutional or individual slights that happen to essentially go towards people feeling this, that they don't belong. An example of a microaggression that I hear often as a woman of color is "you're so articulate," which is true, and yes, comes from a place of bias and that thinking that I would not be because of the diversity characteristics I occupy. So I don't want to make the assumption that everybody's been through diversity training and knows what we're talking about, because I know that is a bad assumption. But you should look into microaggressions if you've never heard of the term, because it's important in terms of thinking about the ways in which we experience trauma as people of color within the workplace. I want to take a moment to do a little bit of housekeeping. This session is certified for CLE, and as such, I'll give you the code now, and I'll give you the code again at the end of the session. So write this down. The CLE code is SS, that's Sam 3275. I'll repeat, SS Sam 3275. Attendance forms will be provided to you post-webinar in an email. And now that we've gotten past that, I'm going to go ahead and talk to Lindsay about how does racial trauma show up in a legal workplace?
Sure, thank you very much. I think in my experience, it's shown up in very practical ways, and I'll just give two of several examples that many of us have experienced. So right after George Floyd, we had all of the protests, the Black Lives Matter related protests, and my firm owns a beautiful historic building downtown in Indianapolis. It's an historic place. It's immediately recognizable if you visit Indianapolis, and the firm takes great pride in it. Anyhow, one of the weekends, protesters protested around the building, and they broke out a few of the windows of the building. As you might imagine, we have insurance, but that's besides the point. What happened was that an email emanated from somebody in our Indianapolis that complained about the windows being broken. Now, I'm not in Indianapolis. I work in Chicago, but I immediately began to receive that email, which was forwarded over and over again. All of the Black lawyers, particularly the young Black lawyers, were blowing my phone up, calling me about it, and they all had the same point. We're not saying that breaking the glass is a good thing, but how could the firm acknowledge the breaking of our physical building and not acknowledge the death of any of those people who died? And it was a really difficult moment because, you know, it took a while for other people at my firm to sort of recognize the import of that. They sort of viewed it as, you know, be safe, be careful, and it's too bad that people are breaking glass, but didn't say anything about any of those other incidents. And for many of us, we've experienced that in so many worlds. You know, as lawyers, we just don't have experience in our workplace. We also live in privileged places. Like I live in the South Loop in Chicago, and there's a South Loop Facebook page, and I was amazed by the posts that I saw during those periods, and many of whom were from lawyers, because I would go find their LinkedIn pages and like, this fool cannot possibly, oh, you're a lawyer? Oh, you work at one of the biggest firms in America? Oh, I'm also not surprised. So, you know, there are very practical ways. There are even more practical ways. I'll just give you one more example because it sticks out to me. Word from somebody else in our office who's heard this several times. You know, we have a colleague that says quite regularly, it's never been harder to be a white man in America. Immediately in the aftermath of all of these protests. I mean, that is the sentiment. So I think in a legal workplace, practically in many ways, it has confirmed our worst suspicions about the colleagues that we work with.
There's an exclamation point right there. Erica.
Yeah, this is included in the materials that you all received. I had a story that came out last year about workplace-induced PTSD. And really quickly before I get into it, I think one thing I want to preface it with is to say, you know, I think in the past year, you see a lot of people saying, you know, listen to Black women because they will save us. Put Black women in positions of power because they will save us, right? And I think that is not necessarily the reason we should be putting Black women into leadership positions, right? I think as a human being, everybody wants to have the feeling they can live up to their full potential, right? So don't put me in a leadership position because you want me to save you. Put me in a leadership position so that I can benefit from all the like education and experience that I bring to the table, right? So that I can have that sense of fulfillment, which is connected to this brief story that I want to share. You know, so when I started, and I guess let me say one thing, let me also give you this background. Black women are very underrepresented in law firms. I don't want to downplay the experience of other minorities. It's not a competition, but we know that it was only in the past year that Black women recovered from the pre-recession levels. And what that means is not only did we just recover, that means there's been no growth in the presence of Black women associates in large law firms. And so I think what that means is that law firms can often be a really lonely place and a really hard place to navigate. So when I started my first legal role at a firm that I will not name, but it's your stereotypical large law firm in New York City, you know, I was really struggling overall to really feel like I was fitting in and getting work. But a few months in, I finally felt like I had really hit my stride. And when we got to the end of the year and it was time for reviews, I was completely blindsided by this review that I received from a partner that had not worked with that much. You know, and part of the issue from my perspective was, and I'll say it was a review that was so bad, I could have been terminated from the firm. And my thing was, if I was performing this poorly over many, many months, why is this coming up for the first time? And how can we have a situation where I've got 7 glowing reviews, and then this one person that I've had very little interaction with can now come along and say that I'm not a good associate, right? You know, and looking back on it, I think what it did to me is it really sort of created this like feeling of, oh, no matter how hard I work, someone can just come along and say that none of that matters, right? Because I have this opinion. And I later found out that this was a partner who had had multiple incidents with diverse associates, right? And so I eventually like left that firm. But one thing I came to learn, you know, as I started going to therapy, was that I was really walking around with like PTSD. I was going into all of my other jobs with this sort of sense of distrust, right? And it was really holding myself back, probably not getting the full benefit of being in those spaces, because I was constantly walking on eggshells, being like, oh, there's just going to come a day when someone's going to blindside me with like some bad news, right? Even though I'm trying to do everything correctly. So one thing I want to say, I know this event is really focused on the racial trauma of the past year, but I really think for the people on this call who are allies who are listening, like you really have to understand, right? When these things happen, particularly when they happen repeatedly, people take this with them. It can sometimes have an impact on their whole career. So that's been my experience.
Thank you, Erica. Jacqueline, tell us what all those things mean.
What do they all mean? Oh my goodness. It means we have a long way to go. When you think about the law community, right, and recognizing that there are less than 5% of Black women associates, less than 5% of Black associates, Black partners in this majority white system, and then you have all of these injustices that are happening to Black and brown people, right? It also creates the impact of the racial trauma internally also creates a lot of shame, like a giant juxtaposition of, okay, I am a lawyer, right? I am supposed to uphold the law. I believe in this space while also I am recognizing that this system does not value or support anyone that looks like me. Right. And that is a really hard thing to process, especially over the last year. How do we move forward with all of this? When you think about the traumatic stress, and that's why I wanted to break down that racial trauma is race-based traumatic stress, right? When you take a look at PTSD, you take a look at what people carry with you, right? There's a great book that's called The Body Keeps Score, and it talks about healing trauma as a whole and recognizing that you carry each of those injustices, each of those traumatic events, each of those race-based stressors with you throughout all of your relationships.
So that just, what all of you said obviously triggered for me lots of things, because the work that I do is navigating, trying to have difficult conversations in a place in which people feel comfortable because of the fact that white supremacy exists and is the overlay of all of the ways in which we navigate. And so while I feel I'm skilled at it, I also am a person of color, I'm a Black woman who is doing that work. And so the reason I jumped at saying I wanted to moderate this panel is because I think it's important to remember that you're in it and you're also in it. The walls of every workplace, when we can walk into our workplace, are porous. Right? To your point, Erica, you don't leave everything outside and say, now I'm here just as a lawyer and I'm a robot. You bring everything with you that has impacted who you are up until that moment, every single thing, whether that means that somebody closed the elevator on you right before you tried to get into it, which has happened to me several times, but I'm like, really? I didn't want to be in the elevator with you anyway. So the point is that we have to be really thoughtful about our humanity. And as such, it reminds me that I want to call out something that is happening right now, because I don't know where everyone is, but I know that there's a lot of weather-related trauma that's happening across the country, and that people are experiencing lots of things that they are not used to. And so again, empathy goes out there, as well as there is an increased deluge of violence against our Asian American colleagues as well. And so while we are all Black panel, and what was the last time you've seen that happen? Right, exactly. There's not a fight. It is, we want to combat racism and racial trauma at all of these different points, and making sure we understand our intersections and the ways in which these things impact us all is an important piece of this. And for you allies who are out there thinking, what are we going to do? What can I do? The first thing is empathy, right? For any leader, for any person, the first thing is empathy. And that's why it's important to hear some of the experiences of the folks who are talking, which leads us into our next section and talking some more about them, not just the overarching, but things that have happened. And Erica started us on that path, but I want to delve into it a little bit more. But prior to that, I want to encourage everyone who is on the webinar that if you have questions, you can use the Q&A part of the panel, and you can put any questions at any time. You don't have to wait for the Q&A portion so that we can get to those things. So when Lindsay was talking about the building being more important than the people, those were conversations that happened a lot last summer. A lot of the we're talking about property. And what I would do is connect the fact that Black people in this country started out as property, right? To really bring the line of how racial trauma is literally within our DNA because of what has happened in this country in terms of systemic racism. But the dehumanization of Black people and other people of color is really where we're now seeing people think, oh my gosh, it was been so terrible. I had no idea. How many people heard, and you can raise your hand in your homes, right? I had no idea. And that's a way in which privilege works. When you can jump in and out of experiences, that's a privilege. And we all have certain privileges depending on what we're in. However, what you should know is this is not new for people of color. And to the point that was made earlier by Jacqueline is that we are continually experiencing these things, and not just big things like murders of people on television, but things that have cumulative effects within our institutions. And so I would love to have some conversation at this time, starting with Erica, and particularly going to the point about gaslighting and how that happens internally.
Yeah, I want to say one thing to piggyback off the thing about the body keeps the score, which a lot of people know that I also do a lot of health advocacy work, right? And so I think what people also have to understand is all of this race-based trauma and all these stressors, it also physically shows up in our bodies, right? So we know in the United States that class does not necessarily insulate you from racial health disparities. And having high SES, white collar profession, and one of the reasons for that is because of this phenomenon known as weathering, right? So over time, the toll of all of these racial stressors physically ages our bodies. So as much as we like to say that Black women don't crack, our bodies are cracking inside because of all the racial stress that we experience. And that is one of the factors that has been linked to the racial disparities that we see in maternal mortality. But Paula, to address your question about gaslighting, I will say that in terms of the impact, I think one thing that was really challenging for myself over the summer is, my boss at the time would come to me and say, oh, I really want to get your opinion about things we should be doing on DEI post George Floyd. And I would spend, I would be on calls with him, prepping him for how to have team calls. I would be in team calls, leading the team calls. I was on the DEI committee, I was doing research. And people would just sort of dismiss and talk over all the things that I would say, right? And I think over time, no matter how much mental fortitude you have, right? When you go in rooms and you know that you are the expert on something, not just because of your lived experience, but because you have spent time doing the reading and doing the research, and people are consistently talking over you and dismissing you, there is a little bit of element to gaslighting to that, right? Because you start to say to yourself, well, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I knew, right? Because no one is listening to me. And I'm in a workplace where I'm the only Black woman on my team, and I have no way to force people to listen to me, right? So I think a takeaway for any allies on here, right, is that I'm sure many BIPOC employees were deputized into the role of race educator over the summer, and you probably still are since it's Black History Month, right? And if you are an ally and you are asking people to do that work, it is imperative that you actually listen to them, even if they are telling you things that you do not want to hear.
There's a clap hands emoji on WebEx. Anyway, so to continue on with that line of thought, because there were, to your point about the deputizing of folks and having additional trauma in the time in which they were experiencing trauma, and giving additional work without compensation, there was also something that I saw a lot, which was people having internal folks who were experts in this area, who have the title in this area, who are doing this work, and still not supporting the things in which needed to be supported here because, many reasons in terms of the why and the what. But Corey, you are a multiplier, right? So you have information that comes towards you, you have knowledge, and you help the people who are people of color and from diverse communities within your spaces, and you also advise at the leadership level to both your internal folks as well as to your clients. So as such, you have a lot on your plate. And so my question for you is, what did you see? What were the things that you heard or experienced in terms of the impact of racial trauma for your attorneys, period, but definitely within that time in the last year?
Thank you for that question, Paula. I will start by saying last year felt like a blessing and a curse. A blessing in the sense of something that you've had to navigate in your life when you didn't have power, finally being in a position of leadership where you could actually use that position to do something to benefit the organization and benefit others who look like you, because you didn't have that 20 years ago. So that was the blessing part. The curse part is what you described, which is you're dealing with your own trauma, but it's your job to create space. It's your job to make sure people feel seen and heard. It's your job to help equip the leaders to make sure they behave inclusively so that they don't re-traumatize people who've been traumatized, while at the same time, you just want to call in Black, right? And so what I saw last year on multiple levels was very different than what we've seen in the past. For one thing, I saw attorneys of all colors being much more vocal about what their needs were. And maybe there's a generational shift, or maybe it's a national shift in terms of our comfort in having these conversations. But there definitely was a lot more of outspokenness in terms of what people were needing. For me, I chose, given that I was in that place that you described, I chose to walk out my experience in front of everyone for a reason. So May 25th, George Floyd is murdered. May 26th, I struggled through the workday. May 27th, I emailed the chair of the firm and I was like, I'm taking tomorrow off. I need a mental health day. I didn't say this, but I was thinking because everything is shit, you know, and I'm having trouble focusing. I'm having trouble getting my work done. I'm angry. I'm upset, and I'm traumatized. And I made the conscious decision to put in my out of office that I was taking a mental health day, because I wanted people to know that it is okay for us to acknowledge that we're impacted by what's going on. And I knew that if I did that, I would give others permission to do the same. And what that did was it began to open up the door for others to have conversations with me to say, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, but how can I support the people on my team who may be feeling like you felt? I was blessed to have the opportunity to speak to my firm, in addition to my managing partner speaking to the firm. And it was a chance to basically say, I'm not okay, and others are not okay. We're not okay, and here's why we're not okay. As you can imagine, Lindsay, some people welcomed that, and some people thought, we're finally having an open conversation about these things. And of course, there were some people who, I know because they called my boss, because they didn't like the letter. I was like, well, we're doing this belonging thing now, so hey, we're going to talk about these things. Part of what was important, at least internally, was having conversations with leaders about how they could be inclusive, how they needed to show empathy, how they needed to raise their awareness of what was going on and why it was impacting people, and why it was a work issue. Understanding that you may be needing something from someone tomorrow, but Paula may not be there. Paula is still traumatized by that 9 minutes of video that she just saw of somebody killing another person with his hands in his pocket, with a smirk on his face. So those were some of the things that we saw, at least internally, and it generated a lot of conversation about next steps. What should we be doing internally? How can we be better? Where should we show up? How should we contribute to the community? And what position should we take? And it really opened up the door. I would say it opened up the door positively, because even where people didn't necessarily agree with everything, it gave us the opportunity to have a conversation about why we don't agree and why it is the right thing for us to address this head on. And of course, we've got a wellness, well-being task force we call Cypher's Life. And so part of the collaboration with them was, let's make sure we're circulating resources and having conversations about what's out there to help support professionals experiencing trauma. Yeah, you look like you're about to ask me a question or tell me to shut up.
I'm going to ask for you to pause on the what are we doing about it, because I still want to hear more about what had happened was when it happened. And so Lindsay, I know that you and I have something that we have in common, as we were in the New York Times about this. And so you want to talk about some of the ways in which there was a internal impact on you and others, and how you navigated some of that internal trauma or racial trauma internally.
Sure. I think that before last summer, if you talk to most diverse lawyers and they were able to be completely transparent with you, they would tell you that when you walk into law firms, for example, but probably the same thing at corporations, that the general presumption, although a rebuttable one, was that you didn't trust anybody who wasn't diverse. I think that after last summer, that has transformed into a barely rebuttable presumption. Going back to the example that was given earlier with respect to PTSD, you have a sense walking around in these buildings as if you've been in war and now you've been returned to civilian society. And it's not even in a new country, it's just that somebody signed a peace treaty. So you're still in the same country, you're just sort of walking around on edge all the time, thinking that it may go down. And that has had real impacts on people, because I don't know if other groups really understand what it's like to go to work every day, to spend so many hours working every day with teams you see every day, and wondering that at any moment, you will be thrown under the bus. That if something happens, let's say a pandemic, that you'll be the last one called for an assignment or for a matter, and you have to, fend for yourself. And so that has really been multiplied in this environment, and it's tough. It's really tough. So I think that shows up in very real ways. I mean, I'm not gonna lie to you. There was a moment this morning where I thought to myself, what is the worst that can happen if I quit? It's just I go to work every day, I'm representing my clients, I'm in the middle of filing TROs today, and it's not that. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is this whole rat race where I feel like there's no point for me as a Black person, because, and I know this is an overused word, but I think it's appropriate here, it's a rigged system. So what's the point? And if I'm feeling that way, and I've been practicing for almost 20 years, imagine what younger lawyers are feeling like, and they can see that. And frankly, I can see that on the older generation. They're more checked out than I am. The diverse lawyers who are still at firms, who are close to retirement, I mean, you talk to some of those folks, it is like blank stares hit you back because they've just been through so much. So it really has had a negative daily impact on folks.
Whew, when you said rig system, whew. I want to highlight this point before I ask Jacqueline what her take on with all of the things that were said in terms of this segment, and highlight this. While we started this conversation about the external pieces and how it impacted the internal, irrespective of those things, which we can't really do, but just right for the side for a moment, the way in which the legal profession is structured and the biases that are inherent into the spaces and places that we navigate are really calling to what Erica and Corey and Lindsay and all of us we're talking about, right? It's in the structures too. So that's why this is a continuity, not a new thing, right? When you think about perceptions about your ability to access and why. Were you a part of that diversity program? No, I just applied, right? I just went through the process that you did, right? The assumptions that you were less than at every state. It's the evaluation processes, right? Both structured and non-structured. It's getting cases, it's being able to be uplifted, mentored, and sponsored, right? To feel as if you belong, and then to elevate, right? The whole process of doing what you need to do to get to whatever the promised land is within your legal institution. All of that has systemic barriers that disproportionately affect people of color. just by themselves. And then, right, you add in the layer of those people being not robots and being people and having to navigate in those spaces, right? Corey, I think I saw your hand. Go ahead.
And I can say this in 15 seconds. The one thing people should remember, because I think sometimes this is forgotten, is that just because you're successful or just because you've reached some level of attainment doesn't mean it stops. So what Lindsay just described, even at partnership, it's there. Even as a chief, it's there. Even in the topics that I am the subject matter expert on, that I am hired to lead on, the gaslighting Erica talked about and the Amy Coopering happens on the daily. And you have to figure out how to respond, not react, still be healthy here, still have a healthy career, and show up. And I think that's important for people to realize, because I think they look at the screen and they'll go, oh, assistant GC, she's running her own business. This Paula, she's everywhere. Lindsay, look at that view. Look at that view. He's in a skyscraper building. He's big time, you know?
Yeah.
You're a
and Erica,
therapist. You own your own shop.
So before I come back to Erica, I want to ask Jacqueline to opine. Anything jumped out that you want to talk about before we get into the piece about what are we going to do about this? But I wanted to just see. I saw your head was doing the so I wanted to see, and then I'll go back to Erica. But if not, you can pass the mic if you want to. That's up to you.
No, I was just agreeing. There were so many valid points that were being made, and just ditto.
Okay. Appreciate it and want to make sure I heard you. Erica, what were you going to say?
I wanted to piggyback on what Corey said, right? One of my favorite thinkers is this woman, Tressie McCotton McMillan. And she in her book, Thick, she talks about this is the best time in America to be alive as a Black person. And Black people still deal with the threat of dying early and probably dying without the resources that they need to retire well, right? That is something that they think about all the time. And so I just really wanted to stress, right, that even though we are talking about racial trauma at work, Black people have to navigate racial trauma everywhere, right? It is always, I always say it's sort of like this invisible hand that is constantly pressing on you, no matter what you have achieved or navigated in life. And I think for people on this call who are allies, like if you really wrestle with that statement, it's the best time to be Black and we're still gonna die young. Like if you really wrestle with that and think about the systemic structures that create that, I think it might lead you to some interesting places, is what I'll say.
Perhaps. Okay, so we kind of laid out sort of the terribleness of it all, right? And I think it's important to talk about what are some of the resources and best practices and things that can be done to help mitigate some of the things we just heard about. And as such, we are going to go to the professional. Jacqueline, what should we do? How can we support people internally when they have experienced racial trauma?
Took me a second to unmute there. Yeah, I mean, we touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking. I think you mentioned empathy, right? And as a psychotherapist, I'm consistently challenging people's ways of seeing the world. And when you think about how small the attorney of color, and nobody's even mentioned the staff of color, right, that are even affected in this profession as well. But when you take a look at the people of color who are in the legal profession and you identify, okay, there is not a lot of space for them, right? You need to make room. Allies need to be able to listen, right? Receive and take what people of color are saying at face value, right? Just because you as a person of privilege or operating from a place of privilege doesn't understand why someone needs to take a mental health day because of a traumatic event that they saw, basically that had people who looked like their family members, right, die or receive injustices happen like levels. Doesn't mean that because you don't understand it doesn't mean that it's not valid, right? And I think the very first thing is to be able to create spaces for people of color to be able to just express that. And I think what Corey did, even having the outgoing message was really fantastic, right? You're setting the tone. You are starting to create a culture where people can talk about what is affecting them, or even just say, you know, I am having a moment, right? I am stressed. And so I think just making that space is the very first step.
I know that making spaces for different groups, particularly from my background as an employment lawyer and seeing some of the guidelines and guardrails, because we're dealing with a primarily legal audience. I know that folks have challenges around that, but I will say in terms of a best practice, it is important to have spaces in which it is just space for coalescing, for understanding, for community, and without allies in that space. And I'm saying that because I hope that everybody's listening, because there needs to be space for non-ally communication and congregation, and then there's space for including everyone so that everyone is a part of the conversation. They are often different places, and so be very sure that you're not taking up space in a way that is detrimental and extra traumatic. So, Lindsay, what are some of the ways in which support can happen or has happened that you think are effective in terms of helping with the racial trauma experience in workplaces?
Sure. Well, not a lot of it has happened, but I have plenty of ideas on what can happen. I'll start off practically with those of you lawyers who are at large law firms. One of the things that I really encourage you to do is to start with your own individual practice, particularly if you have a book of business, and actually look at the numbers. Who have I staffed on my matters that are diverse? What percentages of my work goes to diverse lawyers, especially in the pandemic, and what kind of opportunities are those diverse lawyers getting? I issued a challenge like that to a small group at my firm, and the results were incredible. I mean, I had a few people call me back and say, hey, I never looked at that. I looked at all of my matters. It turns out I've never worked with anybody in the last decade or 20 years, and I just never even thought of it. Or I've worked with one person for 3 years, 10 years ago, and that person is gone. And so it really takes a look in the mirror. I have more ideas on what law firms could do, but I'll move to corporations because that area is really bothering me today. Because even though we're seeing corporations focus on increased work for lawyers of color, that is an incorrect assessment of what needs to change. There are lawyers like myself who are actually quite busy. Getting another TRO or another case won't help me one bit unless I am the relationship lawyer on a case. And what we've seen, even in the wake of Black Lives Matter, is a rigged game of musical chairs where only majority lawyers tend to have a ticket to play the game. Well, what does that mean? That means that you took the business away from one firm and gave it to another firm, but when you gave the work to the new firm, you also gave it to a majority lawyer. You never even bothered to check whether the Black person who showed up for that pitch would actually get credit for that work. And they know you didn't, because it's a rigged game. And you know what? You know you didn't, because maybe you don't care all that much. So, I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I'll stop there, and we'll see how much time we have left. Thank you.
Lindsay's book will be released in November. So, we're starting some of the ideation around what can be done. Erica, what are your thoughts about what has been effective in terms of addressing this?
I mean, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer, but I think when you look at the numbers of minorities in law firms, I don't necessarily think anybody is doing it well, right? Because otherwise the numbers would be better. In the interest of time, I'll give my two solutions very quickly. The first, to piggyback on Lindsay, is really intentional sponsorship, right? I think often we think that when people are successful, they are naturally successful. And no matter what, when people are successful in the legal industry, it's because someone took an interest in their career and they were very intentional about it, right? And so if you are an ally, you should ask yourself, like, is there a minority attorney in my life that I am sponsoring? And if the answer is no to that question, you should interrogate that. We're lawyers. That's what we get paid to do. We get paid to think about things deeply and interrogate them. The second thing I will say is consistency, right? I think what a lot of corporations and law firms do that causes additional trauma to their employees is that they say that they're committed to DEI and then they take actions that undermine that, right? I'll give you the example of my former employer. Many of you know there's a country singer, Morgan Waller, who was caught on video, I think 2 weeks ago, saying the N-word. And so many record labels and streaming services pushed his music off of the platform. My old employer was like, well, we can't remove him from the organization, so we're going to have BB Winans, a Black person, reach out to him and educate him about why using the N-word is wrong, right? So first off, I just have to say that's not appropriate. If anybody thought that was appropriate, asking a Black person to do education, to educate a white person about why the N-word is wrong. And I know that that statement and decision came from the highest levels of the organization. And so when you do things like that, it tells me, the employee or a former employee in this case, that you don't actually care about DEI, because if you did, you would not do something so misguided. And so I think organizations have to holistically look at what they do and be consistent.
What I will say is you can absolutely hire somebody to talk about why using the N-word is wrong, and here she is. I'm happy to help to navigate that, and that's what I do, but that's because that's what I do. Right? It's not overburdening the people who work for you or align with you in order to do so. And it should be appropriately done. Corey, what are some of the things, in addition to out of office responses and taking off Black, that can be done to help support people when they're experiencing racial trauma?
Yeah, so I'll make mine specific. I love the suggestions Lindsay and Erica gave, and they're very holistic. I think we take what Jacqueline said and make it activated. How do you create spaces where people can be seen and heard? Well, you create a safe space where they can come and they can share their experiences, and where they can be listened to and not judged or retaliated against because of that. We create an environment where we model from leadership up all the way down that we are open to acknowledging the impacts on our health physically and emotionally that come from race-based traumatic stress. One of the things that we did was we did a Black professionals check-in within a few days of this happening. Jacqueline, to your point, it's not just the lawyers, it's everybody, right? So we did that, and of course there were some leaders who thought, should I show up? And I was like, no, it's just for the Black folks this time. I mean, there are the things we do that's holistic, but this is just for them. And we brought in a therapist. We brought in somebody like Jacqueline, who could not only help me, because we do these diverse attorney check-ins every month where I check in with everyone, but can bring that psychologist background to help them unpack what's going on and give them strategies. I personally believe that law firms, corporations, but the legal industry in particular, needs to have robust well-being programs. We are a sick profession. We're a profession with amongst the highest rates of alcoholism, addiction, depression, you name it. And a well-being program is only good if it adequately intersects and embraces inclusion and diversity. So that's something that needs to happen. To Erica's point, there has to be accountability. From my perspective, it is not helpful if we do a Black professional check-in, if we have these programs on racial trauma, and then we have leaders that act like jackasses to the people who work with them. When somebody is going through some trauma because they've lost people in their family to COVID because it's disproportionately impacting us, and they're dealing with race-based trauma, who only cares about that deposition outline they've been waiting for? It completely undoes all the work that we've done. And so we have to teach leaders what it means to be inclusive, but like Erica said, we gotta hold them accountable. And if people aren't doing the things they're supposed to do, we need to have conversations with them, and there need to be consequences. But
if I could write a book on this. If I could write a book, it'd be called "You Need to Be Accountable to the Things That You Said," and actually hold yourself accountable, but you're the one who has to hold yourself accountable, so it's probably not going to happen in the way that I want it to have systemic change. Paula and Corey, right? Like that's what it would be called. Jacqueline, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add two things. I think Erica's point to having allies mentor BIPOC attorneys, younger attorneys, is perfect. Allies, if you are considering this, make sure you check your biases, check in with yourself, because there's nothing worse than trying to mentor someone who you are struggling to identify with and then perpetuating all of these stereotypes and microaggressions, because it hurts in the long run. And the second thing is, to Corey's point, it is fantastic that law firms need to have their own robust wellness programs, because the ABA Wellness Pledge was not enough. There is not an intersectional space in there. The sample size was way too small. And when you take a look at what exactly is written in there, there's nothing to identify the fact that people of color attorneys, people of color staff in the legal profession experience the suicide, the alcoholism, the drug substance abuse almost double the rate as other attorneys. And so I think it's very important that each firm do their due diligence as it relates to what their community and what their people need.
Agreed. And I know that we have only a few minutes left. I do want to address, there's one question that I'm going to pull from the Q&A. There's several, and hopefully some of what we've said is weaved into some of the responses, but there's one question that I think is one that we should respond to. As an ally hiring partner at my firm, and with a renewed focus on improving recruiting and hiring practices by encouraging diversity, addressing racial injustice, advancing equity, how do I fight against comments like, "You're discriminating against white men"? Lindsay?
Yeah, so I don't know if I handle those conversations well as a general rule, because I am a litigator, and so I immediately follow a statement like that with a series of questions designed to make a point. And, so I've already made the decision that there are bridges I'm willing to burn. I don't think you're in that same position. So you have to, I don't really know, because I struggle with this because I don't know if let me just stop hiding. I don't think the answer is diplomacy or gradual movement. I think we have to root out these sorts of people and tell them the truth. And I think the problem is that too long we've sort of been placating people, pretending like that there's a bright side to this. In the same way, I hear some fools on TV talking about the bright side of a pandemic. Are you crazy? I'm generally a happy person. I'm optimistic, but I'm not so happy in the middle of a pandemic when I see people dying. And so, yeah, if there's a fool like that in my law firm, that want to play a clown game, I'm going to play the clown game with them. So I don't think that answers your question, but I do feel good saying that.
Well, and I see that, and I actually am sitting here like, you know what? I'm glad I punted to you first, because it sounds like something you need to say, and let's go ahead and do that. Erica, what were you going to say?
Someone said this to me a while ago, and it makes a lot of sense, right? If I'm a doctor and I have a patient who has a broken leg, and I have one who just sprained their finger, I'm not going to treat them the same, right? And in fact, it would be malpractice if I treated them the same, right? Because they have different injuries. And I think this is the same thing that we are talking about when we talk about diversity in the profession. It's not discriminating against white men to do more, to get more of us into the industry, because so long we have been treated differently. Giving us extra resources and help and focusing on hiring for us mitigates that impact, right? We've been treated differently, so you have to treat us differently in order to fix the problem, and to pretend otherwise is its own form of malpractice. That's what I would say to that person.
Jacqueline?
I'm going to give you the clinical response. There's no point in arguing with stupidity, right? And so the ally, the hiring partner who wrote this, thank you, right, for writing it. And I would encourage you to simply respond with, I disagree, and keep it moving. Because at the end of the day, that exchange does less for you and less for your purpose than it does feeling like you have changed this person's mind, which it doesn't seem like you will if that's where they're coming from.
So as we are at the hour, I wanted to close us out by one more saying the CLE code. I have to do the work. CLE code is SS Sam 3275. SS 3275. You will receive a post-webinar email that has attendance forms. And I want to just respond to that comment as well by saying this. The way in which white supremacy works and how it trickles down into our institutions means that we live in a space where there are people who are privileged who don't have to interact with different topics or different things ever. And as such, when their lives are shifted, when things are different and it's not what they usually experience, of course it feels like something's being taken away. And so my empathy, and this, you might be looking at me like, Paula, what? I have empathy because whenever change happens, it means that you're uncomfortable, right? And so my therapist, who I love very much and who should be lauded at all times, she says, growth begins where comfort ends. We don't have to be comfortable, to Lindsay's point, but we have to tell the truth and we have to hold people accountable. So we have to understand that we're talking about equity and not removing of opportunity. It's there for everyone. We just have to see that. And so with that, I'm going to encourage all of you who are here attending and wanting to ally and do better to take the task that was given. Do differently. Ally and sponsor and connect with somebody who is different than you and watch how the world changes, not just for them, but for you. We all have to be in this in terms of addressing racial trauma because we're all traumatized by anybody in our experiences experiencing trauma. So that being said, go out, do good, wash your hands, and thank you so much for joining us at the Belonging Project here today. Connect with us all on LinkedIn and be well, everyone. Have a good, happy Black History Month. Bye, everybody. All right. Are we still